Ladies and gentlemen, the Berkeley historian Martin Malia once asserted that no nation had prepared its revolution longer or more self-consciously than Russia. Malia even argued that the roots of the revolution in Russia could be traced back to ideologies of the late 18th century Russian Enlightenment. Well, we haven't traced the roots of the revolution that far in our series of lectures, but we have seen that since the turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century, that the revolution was in a sense an overdetermined phenomenon. That is to say that there were many reasons to think that a revolution in Russia would come. The conservative government of Nicholas II failed to deal in a timely way with the imperial difficulties of managing a multinational empire. It is also the case that the efforts of the Tsar to build a great economic power in Russia and thereby enhancing capitalism and the market in Russia contributed to social antagonisms in this period. We also saw how the constitutional experiment that began in 1905, 1906 failed, and we saw that the First World War exacerbated existing tensions and guaranteed that at some point the existing government would not survive. And yet, the strange thing is that when the revolution actually came in February, March of 1917, it was like a thief in the night. It came as a surprise to many of the people that predicted that it would come, and the form that it took was unusual, not what had been expected. And this is one of the nice things about history, that people think they can control it, but it ends up that events always surprise them in some way or another. What I want to do today is to talk about the two revolutions of 1917. It is a common mistake that people make when they think about the Russian Revolution of 1917 to think that in February and March it was the Bolsheviks that overturned the imperial government. But that wasn't the case. In fact, the February and March Revolution was something that was to a certain extent uncontrolled and spontaneous and therefore surprising to its participants. The Bolsheviks did not seize power until October of 1917. So 1917 is really a year of two political revolutions. That is, two different regimes were installed. But we must also be aware that these events were profoundly linked. They were experienced in a kind of seamless way by the participants. They blended one into another, and the underlying factors that made for the overthrow of the Tsarist regime in 1917, early in the year, also prepared the way for the doom of the provisional government that succeeded it. So this is the subject of today's lecture. Now, as we contemplate how the revolution finally occurred, we must think about the situation in the imperial capital. In 1914, the name of the capital had been changed from St. Petersburg to Petrograd because it seemed that to the participants in the government and in society, participants in the war, that Petrograd was somehow a more Russian-sounding name. So the city doesn't change, actually. It remains to longtime inhabitants simply Peter, and the city blocks are recognizable, but there's a psychological shift. So we'll be talking about what happened in the imperial capital, now Petrograd. In Petrograd, from 1914 on, the situation of workers had changed in a material sense. First of all, workers were now putting their backs, their muscles, their minds into war production. And this meant that they were working typically in the metallurgy industries, that factories that dotted the outskirts of the imperial capital. It meant that they were working 11 to 12-hour shifts. This meant that war production meant that factory inspectors were rather loose in terms of supervising safety violations, because the priority for the Russian government was to maximize production, so damn the torpedoes and full speed ahead. Accidents, therefore, industrial accidents were more common in the war period. There was a terrible explosion in an armaments factory in 1915, which was very destructive, killed 100 people who worked inside the factories. There are anecdotal cases of poisoning by poor ventilation, industrial products accumulating in a given plant, and the workers becoming sick. So workers on the factory floor experienced the war as a trial, as a difficulty, an ordeal. Outside of the factory, there was an acute housing shortage. Because of the need for more rapid industrial production, the government paid what it thought were premium wages, and it tried to help entrepreneurs recruit people for the factories. But the housing situation in the capital didn't change for the better. A greater number of workers were crowded into the same space. And the result was that by late 1916, housing prices, if you calculate rents, as compared to early 1914, had roughly quadrupled. And if you adjust for inflation, there was a net loss for workers. Then there is the complication that workers faced of food shortages. These food shortages had to do with difficulty in the Russian railroad administration. Obviously, during war, the priority in war production is supply of the army. And so existing food stocks were shipped by rail to the front so that soldiers might have enough to eat. But this meant that in the big cities, incidentally not only in Petrograd but also in Moscow, in the big cities there were food shortfalls. Even grain by late winter of 1916 was in short supply at the mills. There was only about 3 to 4 days flour supply that was left in February of 1916. So there was a critical food shortage problem, and the workers felt this not only an inconvenience, you couldn't find various things at the stores, but also food was very dear. It was sold at a high rate, and in fact, the rate of inflation for essential foodstuffs in December and January of 1916, 1917 was running at about 20 to 25% each month. So the Petrograd worker felt this in the pocketbook as well. Now, at the beginning of the war, because people had rallied around the flag, there were relatively few industrial strikes. But as the war wore on, as people became more and more disappointed with the performance of the armed forces, and also as they became more and more concerned that the war was endless, that the regime had gotten the country into an endless conflict that Russia could possibly perish from, people soured on the government, they turned radical in their mood, and this prepared the psychological groundwork for the, as I said, unexpected events in terms of their timing that would follow in the revolution. Now, how did the revolution actually begin? Well, historians have generally asserted that on the 23rd of February, by the old Russian calendar, you have to add 13 days to adjust to the Western or Gregorian calendar, that there began a series of events that were familiar to people, and therefore somehow they weren't perceived as the first day of the revolution. There was a food riot. It was a food riot that occurred in the middle of an afternoon when women who worked at one of the textile factories outside the center city in Petrograd rioted because there was not any bread for them to purchase. And this riot spread very quickly from the women workers to metallurgy workers who were in nearby, that is to say, contiguous industrial plants. So there were roughly, by the end of the day, some tens of thousands, one guess is about 75,000 workers out on strike, protesting mainly the lack of bread. So the pinch in workers' pocketbooks and the exasperation that they felt during the war led to this chain of events. Now, by the second day of the revolution, there were about 200,000 people out on the street. And by this second day of the revolution, we call it the second day now retrospectively, people were beginning to understand that there was a possibility that the regime would topple. This might be the unexpected moment that Russians had long waited for, what Chernyshevsky once had called the true day, when social justice would come. Over the next several days, 5 days in all, the regime attempted to adjust to the chaotic and now very threatening situation in Petrograd. It did so by putting additional police on the street. It tried to call on the military to suppress the strike, but things had gone too far. They had got out of control. If you study the telegrams that go back and forth between Petrograd and the local police constabulary, ministers who are imperial ministers and assessing the situation, you find that in the second and the third day even of the revolution that they tend to underestimate in their reports to Nicholas the severity of the situation. And this is for understandable reasons. They're trying to protect the hindmost, and maybe they didn't see that in fact the whole structure of the empire was threatened by these events in the capital. Nevertheless, by the fourth day, the imperial police were very well aware that the life of the regime was in jeopardy. And at this point, Nicholas issued an order to crush the revolution and to do so immediately and without thought of mercy, but because the last guarantor of the regime's stability, namely the army that was billeted, reserve troops waiting to be sent to the front, the army billeted in the capital refused to suppress the workers, refused in many cases to fire on brothers, and in certain cases actually killed their officers because of the defection of the army at the last moment. Imperial control in the capital collapsed. Now, this did not immediately mean that Nicholas II had to abdicate the throne, but it certainly set off a chain of events that led to his abdication. People in authority in the army, I'm talking about generals who were commanders of fronts. I'm also talking about a man called Alexeyev, who was a trusted aide of Nicholas and a very distinguished military strategist, able general. All of these people began to assess whether the army could survive a situation in which the emperor had lost control of the capital, and he'd long ago lost the affection of what you might call the ruling elites of the country. And if you read between the lines of telegrams that are sent back and forth between the generals, you see that they feel that it is their patriotic duty to inform the Tsar that he can no longer continue in office. And this advice, and in fact this pressure from the military, rather than Nicholas' sober assessment of what had happened in the capital, or pressure from politicians, for whom Nicholas basically had contempt, it was the pressure from the generals that decided him. Nicholas decided that it was his patriotic duty to abdicate. He abdicated first to his son, Alexei, who was hemophiliac, who was ill. Then Nicholas changed his mind because he couldn't bear to part with the son, and he thought it would burden him too much. So he abdicated in favor of another relative, the Grand Duke Mikhail. The Grand Duke Mikhail, told that the emperor had abdicated in his favor, thought long and hard for a day or so, and he asked politicians in the capital from the old Imperial Duma, could they guarantee his safety if he were to accept the throne, even as a regent? And the answer was no. It was a blunt answer, maybe a disappointing answer. It was probably an honest answer, because who in a revolutionary situation could take responsibility of this sort? So by the middle of the second week in March, the imperial regime had ceased to exist. Nicholas had abdicated in favor of Mikhail. Mikhail had refused to take the throne, so Russia was left, in a sense, with a chaotic situation. Now, note here, as we have described these events, that I have refrained from mentioning political parties. I haven't said, and then the Bolsheviks did this, or then the Mensheviks did that. Now, in the factories, there were some people who were politically active. But it's important to see that this was a revolution that was not planned. It wasn't decided by revolutionary parties that on a given date we will set off a bread riot and then thus and such and thus and such will follow. It was, as historians tell us, a spontaneous revolution, and that's why it was surprising to the participants. The triumph, if you want to call it a triumph, of the revolution left a power vacuum in the capital. Now, almost immediately, history abhors a vacuum, you know, almost immediately, different agencies, two of them in particular, attempted to fill this vacuum. The first group that attempted to fill the vacuum was a group of leaders from the old Imperial Duma. They felt that in this situation, which was unprecedented, the imperial authority had collapsed or been overthrown, that they were now the legitimate government of Russia, but of course they had only been elected to be members of a legislature. They hadn't been elected to exercise executive authority. So while they felt entitled to step into the vacuum, they did not feel entitled to constitute a new government, write a constitution and all that. They had to wait until something called a constituent assembly, or what we would call a constitutional convention, would be convened in order to sort out details of what Russia's future governmental system was to be like. So the term that is attached to this group of self-appointed former Duma deputies is in Russian временное правительство. It means temporary government. It's often translated in history texts as provisional government, but provisional in the sense that it's a caretaker government that only lasts for a certain period. The other agency that rushes into the vacuum also is self-appointed, and it is the so-called Petrograd Soviet. Now, what is this Soviet? Well, we talked earlier in our discussion of the revolution of 1905 about the creation of councils, revolutionary councils, that's what Soviet means, in St. Petersburg and Moscow and various other parts of the country. Well, workers had a historical memory. They knew that in the chaos of 1905, there had been a council that was set up. And already on the second day of the revolution, a Petrograd Soviet was established. And the main purpose of the establishment of this Soviet on the second day of the revolution was simply to find out what happens. What is going on? Who is involved in strikes and so on and so forth? And in order to find out what was going on, people delegated to trusted workers from given factories on some formula. I mean, historians will say that for every 500 workers there was one delegate appointed to the Provisional Soviet. Well, it really didn't work out that way. It was a much messier situation like that. But workers themselves gravitated to a certain building, and they began to constitute themselves into a sort of assembly. So this was the original basis for the Petrograd Soviet. Now, once the Soviet was coming into existence, people in the political parties decided to take advantage of it for their own purposes. First of all, they wanted to know what was happening on the factory floors and assess the mood and so on. But they also knew that the Soviet could be a body that could lead a revolution, or at least exercise a concerted voice in the revolution. And so you might call them self-appointed leaders of the various political parties also gravitated to the Soviets. And when they got there, they took control. They established themselves in a so-called executive committee of the Soviet. And in this smaller body, they were able to begin to issue orders, instructions, make resolutions, and so on. Sometimes they got workers to approve these orders. Other times they simply issued the orders in their own names. Now, politically speaking, at this point, the people who dominate the Petrograd Soviet are socialist revolutionaries. So these are the agrarian socialists, who also had a presence in the capital, incidentally. The Mensheviks, who were social democrats and who had a pretty wide following in the labor movement in Petrograd. And then there was a smaller number of Bolsheviks, that is, of Lenin's party. Over time, that is, as the revolution moves from March to October, both the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet moved to the left. That is, they were radicalized. By the time that we look at the Petrograd Soviet in September and October of 1917, the dominant forces are no longer the SRs and the moderate Mensheviks, but they are the extreme left wing of the SRs, the few radical Mensheviks there are, and the Bolsheviks. If you look at the provisional government, it was no longer the moderates who came from the Duma that were in the control, but half of the membership of the provisional government consisted of SRs or other revolutionaries, and only the more radical members of the Constitutional Democratic Party were represented. Those were the ones that were, as we saw earlier, more inclined to make alliance with the radicals all along. So, history abhors the vacuum. The vacuum is filled in Petrograd in this way. And all across the country, the vacuum that was created by the sudden collapse of imperial power in the capital was also being filled, sometimes by old government officials, and in other cases by the action of Soviets that were elected or appointed, called into existence in the same chaotic way that I have described happening in the capital. Now, let us turn to the question of what the provisional government actually did in the first months, especially, of its existence. As I pointed out, the provisional government at first consisted of Duma politicians, excluding the right wing. These were the anti-czarist forces, the Republican, as it were in the French sense of the term, politicians from the Duma. And as you might expect, these people attempted to reform the political process, to pass certain social reforms, but also to guarantee that Russia would not withdraw from the war. And they tried to guarantee that the process of political revolution wouldn't lead to a much more serious and uncontrollable social revolution that would destroy property rights in the country and result in a terrible bloodbath. So this is what they were about. The provisional government adopted a series of very sweeping reforms. In fact, one of the most astonishing periods of reform in all of Russian history. Early in March, the government created an amnesty for political and religious crimes. So this meant the release of political prisoners and prisoners of conscience from jail. On the 12th of March, the government abolished capital punishment. This was a universally applauded decision. It was something that symbolically put an end to the old regime system of justice. Incidentally, however, it lasted only about 4 months, this abolition. 15,000 criminals were released from prison because it was decided that the old regime had been too harsh in its punishment of criminals. The sentences were too long, so they were commuted. 15,000, most of them hardened criminals, incidentally, were let out onto the street, and this led to a kind of danger to people for their lives and for their property in the middle of 1917. The police, the imperial police, were abolished. And in the place of the police, there was put a citizens' militia. Militia was supposed to consist of educated people who were 21 years old and having at least a high school education. Now, that was something remarkable in Russia because the high schools were quite good. But in fact, most of the militias didn't measure up to those standards. In addition to these reforms, the government abolished censorship except for military censorship, which was understandably continued. The government on the 20th of March lifted all discriminatory legal restrictions against religious and national groups. Now there were no passports of an internal nature, no restrictions that were placed on people's places of residence. One could choose one's own occupation. Everybody in the country, Jewish, Muslim, whatever, was able to work in the civil service. All the quota laws that were keeping Jewish people in particular out of higher education, these were eliminated. In the Western periphery, discriminatory language laws that had worked against the Poles and certain religious restrictions that had worked against Catholics in that area, these were eliminated. The provisional government adopted, for the first time in Russian history, a voting reform that provided for universal access to the polls on the part of males and females. Now, if you think about the situation in England, there was a suffrage movement, but there was not yet suffrage for women. You think about our own country's history. There was a very powerful suffrage movement that was protesting during the war and before the war about women's not having the right to vote. Well, Russia beat to the punch, as it were, the British, the French, the Americans, every major country in permitting women to vote. And it was the boast of some of the Russian politicians in the provisional government that Russia, under the provisional government, was the freest country on earth in terms of laws, and also the most progressive, because women were permitted to vote. Now, these pieces of legislation that I have talked about are extraordinary pieces of legislation by anyone's standard. So there was some substance to the provisional government's boast about the progressive nature of the administration. And politically, the provisional government at first was actually not unpopular. I don't say it was popular with members of the Petrograd Soviet who eyed it in a jaundiced fashion, but nevertheless there was a certain real popularity that attached to the provisional government. The question one must confront, if one says that this popularity is real, is why did the provisional government so quickly forfeit this popularity? Why did it, by October, become so unpopular as to be overthrown? It seems to me here that one must address the social issues for which workers in particular were fighting, and also the matter of the war. Now let's talk about the social issues, and let's talk about the matter of the war. If you think about the social issues, workers are interested in the right to assemble, the right to unionize, and under various provisions of laws that the provisional government passed, they were permitted to do this, but they were not permitted to strike. They were theoretically granted the right to have an 8-hour day, so the length of their shift was in theory reduced by about 3 hours, but the implementation of that law was delayed until the end of the war. So people in the capital who were workers could look around after a time and say, the powers have done a lot of things for them, but what have they done for us? Now, there were many people in Russia who were peasants. And the SR party, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, spoke in the interests of the peasants. And they were strongly represented, as I pointed out, in the Petrograd Soviet. What were the peasants interested in? They were interested in control of the land. They wanted noble lands, noble-owned lands and merchant-owned lands that were close to their communal lands in the center of Russia to be dispersed to the people. And everybody then was to work the land by the sweat of his or her own brow and enjoy the fruits of his or her own labor, but not more than that. Now, the provisional government recognized in many statements by its Minister of Agriculture and in resolutions of various sorts that the land question was the most important social problem that Russia faced. However, the provisional government could not solve the land question at this time. It delayed a solution to the land question until the Constitutional Convention would meet. Now, why? Why put off the solution of such an important problem? It seems to me the answer is very simple. Once it was decreed by the provisional government that the land would be divided, the army, which consisted 80% of peasants, would simply melt away. There would be no force on earth powerful enough to arrest the flow of peasants from the front to their homes. because these people were family men and they were committed to justice for their families, and they would have to see that their families were fairly treated in a redistribution of land. So the solution to the social problem of the land had to be delayed because of the war. And this is the final point about the provisional government's unpopularity. You strip away all of the reforms, all of the rhetoric, all of the democratic sounding slogans, and Russians saw that there was continuity in foreign policy. The first foreign minister of the provisional government, Paul Milyukov, the head of the Constitutional Democratic Party, promised continuity instead of change. And this meant that Russians under the provisional government would have to live with the endless war, and that they could not tolerate. Now, what about the Petrograd Soviet? At first, as I pointed out, the Soviet was dominated by pretty moderate socialists. They were willing even to support the provisional government so long as its activities were progressive, and to that extent. So in other words, these Mensheviks and SRs applauded the provisional government's efforts to fix the judicial system, to release criminals, to end legal discrimination, and all of that. And they applauded even the social legislation, except they wanted it to be implemented. And when the provisional government refused to implement that social legislation, then relations between the Petrograd Soviet and the provisional government went south and soured. Now, one of the problems that was most acute between the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet was control of the armed forces. Provisional government, which claimed to be the legitimate government of Russia at this point, wanted to issue commands to troops in the field. And the Petrograd Soviet, which claimed to represent the interests of workers and soldiers, said that only those commands from the provisional government will be recognized that are countersigned by the executive committee of the Petrograd Soviet. And in fact, the Soviet began to work to coordinate its activities with a very interesting institution that develops in the army itself. Inside of the army, there were soldiers who were elected by other soldiers, not to the status of officer, but to the status of commissar. It's interesting that the term commissar, which is later used by the Bolshevik government, is actually a development of this 1917, middle of 1917 period. And the institution of the commissar in the army meant that the military activities of a given unit were a matter of discussion between the officer corps of the army and the commissar. So inside the army, there was then discussion, and of course this contributed to a further breakdown of military discipline. The Petrograd Soviet understood at a certain point that it spoke for workers in Petrograd and soldiers in Petrograd, but it did not speak, could not speak, for workers and Soviets all over the country, because there were other Soviets. In Moscow, a Soviet, in local areas, peasant Soviets were establishing themselves. So how to coordinate this chaotic situation where there were many Soviets, many centers of authority across the country? It was decided by certain far-sighted leaders of the Petrograd Soviet to create a new institution, the so-called All-Russia Council of Soviets. And twice in the revolutionary year, this All-Russia Soviet met in the imperial capital, and a certain amount of the leadership was provided by these people in the Petrograd Soviet. Now, we come to the nub of the matter. Lenin and his contribution to the revolution in October. At first, this is rather surprising ideologically, Bolsheviks on the scene played along with the provisional government and with their comrades from other socialist parties in the Petrograd Soviet. That is to say, they accepted the leadership of the provisional government so long as it was progressive. Lenin, who was at the beginning of 1917 in exile in Switzerland, was writing furious letters to his comrades in Petrograd demanding that they stop this policy of concessions. Finally, in April of 1917, Lenin got passports, was sent in a sealed train from Switzerland across German territory. He arrived at the Finland station, and immediately he confronted his party colleagues. In a document called the April Theses, which was published as an article, it was also given as a speech, Lenin said, "You must understand that the policy of support for the bourgeois provisional government must come to an end. The policy of the party, of the Bolshevik Party, must be the revolutionary seizure of power by the proletariat." This is the Leninist ideology that he had been preaching all along consistently. People on the scene at first voted this policy down, but soon, within a couple of weeks, he managed to persuade his party colleagues. There then followed a series of experiments, of dalliances with revolution by the Bolsheviks. In July, for example, of 1917, the party came very close to sponsoring a military coup d'etat against the provisional government, but at the very last minute, Lenin backed off and pulled the plug because he thought that the experiment was premature. Finally, in October of 1917, 10th of October, the mood in the capital was right. 12 members of the Bolshevik Central Committee met inside of an apartment. Lenin arrived at the meeting in disguise, and there was a debate, a furious debate about seizure of power. Now, let me briefly characterize this debate, very briefly, but it's very important to understand the psychology of the revolution. The minority in this debate, which was defended by two people called Kamenev and Zinoviev, said the following. They said the provisional government is not supported by the workers and is no longer supported by the political parties in the Soviet. On the 26th of October, when the Second All-Russian Council of Soviets is set to meet, we can eliminate the provisional government by coordinating with all the other socialist parties. And we can form an all-socialist government. So the revolution could come to power by legal means. And Lenin's argument? Absolutely not. It would betray the revolution, he said, if we would wait until the Second All-Russian Council of Soviets. In fact, we must move now to seize the power and present the All-Russian Council of Soviets with a fait accompli. And this is what the party, by a vote of 10-2, voted to do. It took 2 weeks to organize the revolution, to establish a military revolutionary committee, but the job was done. And so after seizing bridges and communications and all the things that revolutionaries do, the new government could present itself on the 26th of October to the Soviet and to the world as the inheritors of the revolutionary mantle.